I want to share with you, first of all, a letter from Egon Schiele to a certain Mr. Franz Hauer on the 30th of August 1913. In this letter, Schiele writes, "Dear Mr. Hauer, I am asking you to entirely fulfill the wish I wrote in my letter to you a few days ago, if possible, however uncomfortable this might be for you and me. Even if at the moment it might be somewhat difficult for you, I hope that you won't frown at me this time either. I believe in your kindness. With warm greetings, Egon Schiele. At present in Sattendorf on Osiaschersee, Carinthia, Tommelbauer." Now, what do you reckon the wish he's asking Mr. Hauer to fulfill is? Because I have a strong feeling that what Schiele is referring to in this letter is a sum of money. And I spent this morning, without necessarily planning to, but I just stumbled across a lecture online from Jane Kelleher, who is a very important writer on Schiele and Schiele's art and work. And this lecture was called "Patronage and Portraiture in the World of Egon Schiele." So this morning I spent my time before rehearsals listening to this 45-minute lecture online and then taking some notes. And it's very interesting, actually, to try and understand the life of an artist from the point of view of money and how one kind of survives and deals with all of the kind of tensions and realities that are just a part of being an artist, and in particular an independent artist, which was a huge kind of discovery for me last week, the video I mentioned yesterday about me aligning myself with independent artists. So anyway, I want to try and sketch in a few points, if I can, that I was getting from the lecture this morning. I suppose the first point of interest that I learnt was that in 1890, the year Schiele was born, there was a lot of change taking place in relation to portraiture, which was hugely important in Austrian art, and a huge change taking place in how portraiture was being patronized. So the two key things that happened was, firstly, the advent of photography, which was widely accessible now and would cost far less. You know, photography would just be far cheaper to run and execute than having someone paint a portrait. And then the second thing was, through the capitalist industrialization, the emergence of the bourgeoisie replacing or kind of overpowering the aristocracy meant that it was more steel magnets and these kind of industrial heirs and super rich kind of steel and sugar and, you know, all of these kind of industrial class. They were the ones now kind of calling the shots and having things like portraits being painted. So that was kind of all part of the time in which Schiele was growing up in and would eventually become part of when he was at the age of creating his own work as well. And then linked to that is this idea of the Künstlerschaft. Now, as I understand it, I could be wrong and there could be more detailed elements of it. But the way I kind of envision Künstlerschaft at the moment is it's kind of this ideal communion between the artist and patron. I get the sense that the ideal is that it's a very, very intimate and personal relationship, and there is no kind of middleman, there's no dealer. It's a very sort of collaborative partnership, if that makes sense. And I suppose the succession, 1897, established with Gustav Klimt at the helm, is one sort of manifestation or embodiment of this ideal of the Künstlerschaft, a kind of collective organization of artists and art appreciators coming together. And so this becomes very, very important in the life of Schiele. And I want to talk about the Big Four. And in terms of the Big Four, who I'm referring to are the Big Four patrons in 1910 who are supporting Schiele. So we have Arthur Rosler, who is an art critic and a very loyal supporter of Schiele. He acted as his sort of agent, friend, dealer, you name it. But he was someone who supported Schiele. Then we've got Dr. Oskar Reichel, who was a physician, and Karl Reininghaus, heir to an industrial fortune. And then another man, Heinrich Benisch, who was a railroad inspector. And it's quite fascinating. I was reading about Schiele's relationship to his patrons, and these four in particular. And there's quite a lot of tensions, and I'm sure there were great moments and bad moments, like you can expect in any kind of intense relationship. But for instance, Schiele complained that ultimately their funds were barely enough for him to afford his paint and canvases. And then his patrons, the likes of Dr. Oskar Reichel and Arthur Rosler, were then complaining that he was asking for too many, he was asking for money too often and asking for loans. So, his patrons were getting annoyed that he was asking constantly for money from them. And then Schiele was getting annoyed that they were annoyed. And it was just a whole kind of back and forth tennis match between them both. And I think ultimately, the relationships did sour a bit in the end, I think, with his patrons, these four at least, sort of thinking that he's not appreciative enough of their support. But the thing is, Schiele was very much into the philosophical element of this idea of the Künstlerschaft. So he was completely adamant in his mind that the artist was absolutely entitled to funds wherever necessary, because he's an artist trying to pursue this exceptionally noble, business of huge importance. And so he just could not ever understand why, they would not, help him whenever he needed it. So there was all of that, and his quartet of patrons, those four boys, and there was no middleman, no kind of dealer at this point in Vienna, so to speak, that were perhaps in other European cities at the time. So that was the first thing I was kind of looking at, the tensions between Schiele and his patrons. He then did end up moving on from these big four and kind of in a way upgrading, because he met a certain Franz Hauer 2 years later in 1912, who was a well-known collector of young artists, and he owned a popular Viennese tavern, the Greisebeisel, And so he was supporting Sheila up until his death 2 years later. He died from appendicitis in 1914. But he bought 9 oil paintings from Sheila, and a huge number of works on paper as well. So there was that figure. And then there was a man, Heinrich Bühler, who was a wealthy steel heir looking for an art teacher. And so he supplied Sheila with paint and canvases and models when they painted side by side, and was also a dedicated collector of Sheila's work, and also gave him a monthly stipend during World War One. And interestingly, in October 1914, he introduced Sheila to a woman called Friederike Maria Beer, who was the girlfriend of Heinrich Bühler's cousin, Hans. And she commissioned a portrait from Sheila. So this was the first unsolicited commission Sheila ever had from a woman. And she was incredibly rich. Every stitch of her clothing was designed by the Wiener Werkstätte. And as an interesting note, Friederike Maria Beer's maid was shocked upon seeing the portrait that Sheila had painted of her, remarking that she looked like she had been entombed. And then you've got Klimt, who of course was very fond of Sheila and introduced him to 2 of his most important collectors, August and Serena Lederer. And Sheila paints their son Erich between Christmas and New Year's at their Hungarian residence. And there was a whole saga, actually, which I forgot to mention, in between this period, which was the 1910 and 1912, which was one of the initial patrons of Sheila. It was Heinrich Benisch, the railroad inspector. He had managed to basically talk to Hans Guld, who was an art director in Germany, in Berlin, and he managed to kind of get a one-man show for Sheila in Germany. And in very typical Sheila fashion, when it came down to the business side of things, Sheila, not understanding that a dealer needs to protect his investment, refused to sign an exclusive contract with Guld. And he said that sort of contractual stipulation should apply only to operetta singers, not to me. And Sheila then says, if I want to, I'll send my works wherever I want. So, unable to count on Sheila's loyalty, Guld was understandably reluctant to risk the